It's funny, the things you get used to, the creak of the third step on the staircase, the way the afternoon sun hits the dust motes, dancing in the living room, the gentle sigh the house seems to give as it settles in for the night. For 50 years, this little house and I have been learning each other's rhythms. I know its secrets, and it certainly knows mine. But the newest rhythm, the drip, drip in the spare bedroom, that was one I couldn't get used to. It was the sound of time winning, the sound of decay, a constant, tiny heartbeat, reminding me that things fall apart. My name is Francis, and for most of my life, I was a librarian. I dealt in stories, in the quiet rustle of turning pages, and the comforting scent of old paper and binding glue. My own story, I thought, was a simple one. I married my dear Arthur. We raised our son Walter in this very house, and when Arthur passed on, I retired and settled into a quiet life, surrounded by my books and my memories. A simple, unassuming life, or so my son believed. The drip had started a few months back, a faint patter only audible during the worst of the spring storms. But now it was a steady, metronomic torment. A dark, ugly stain, the size of a dinner plate, was spreading across the plaster ceiling like a disease. I'd put a bucket underneath it, a large orange thing from the garage, and its hollow plink, 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 was the first thing I heard in the morning and the last thing I heard at night. It was a problem I couldn't solve by shushing it. I did what any mother in my position would do. I called my son. Walter was a stockbroker in the city, a man who wore suits that cost more than my monthly pension, and spoke a language of portfolios and acquisitions that was entirely foreign to me. He was by all accounts a success. The kind of success Arthur and I had always dreamed for him. He had a corner office with a view, a sleek German car, and a wife who looked perpetually annoyed. He was important. He was busy. When I finally got him on the line, his voice was rushed, distracted. I could hear the faint, frantic clicking of a keyboard in the background. "Is everything okay? I'm in the middle of a trade here." I took a breath and tried to make my voice sound smaller, less of an imposition. It's a habit you pick up over the years when dealing with very important, very busy people. "It's the roof, Walter. It's leaking. Badly this time. I called a man, Mr. Henderson, and he said it's not a patch job anymore. He said I need a whole new roof." A sigh came down the line, heavy and theatrical, the kind of sigh that says, "Another problem I don't have time for." "A new roof? Mom, do you know how much that costs? We're talking thousands, tens of thousands." He said it would be about 15,000. I said, the number feeling like a stone in my mouth. "I don't have that, Walter. My pension just covers the bills. You know that." This was followed by a long silence. The keyboard clicking stopped. I imagined him leaning back in his big leather chair, staring out at the city skyline, calculating, not calculating how to help me, I realize now, but calculating how this affected him. "Look, Mom," he said finally, his voice shifting from impatient to condescendingly gentle. "I'd love to help, I really would. But things are tight right now. I'm completely cash poor." Cash poor. The term sounded so absurd. It was like a king complaining about the weight of his crown. He had money. I knew he did. It just wasn't in a form that was convenient for him to access for his mother's leaky roof. It was tied up in things, important things, not a bucket in a spare bedroom. "I understand." I lied. The truth was, I didn't understand it all, but arguing felt unseemly. A mother shouldn't have to beg her successful son to keep the rain off her head. It wasn't about the money. Not really. It was the casual dismissal. The fact that my crisis was nothing more than an inconvenient line item on his mental budget. "I'll see what I can do," he said. A verbal pat on the head. "Maybe I can move some things around in a few months. Just keep the bucket under it for now, okay?" and then he was gone, back to his trades, back to his important life. I stood in my silent kitchen, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone, and in the other room, I could hear it, plink, plink, plink. A week went by, the stain on the ceiling grew, the plinking in the bucket became the soundtrack to my life. I didn't hear from Walter, which wasn't unusual. He was busy. I told myself that over and over. He was busy. He would get to it. Then one evening, the phone rang. It was him. My heart gave a hopeful little flutter. Maybe he'd moved some things around. Maybe he had a solution. "Mom, great news," he began, his voice buzzing with an energy I hadn't heard in years. It was the voice he used when he'd closed a big deal, the one filled with self-congratulation. "I found the most incredible vessel. A real beauty. 42-foot Sea Ray Sundancer. It's perfect for client entertainment. A floating corner office, you know. It's a game changer." I was quiet. "A vessel." I pictured a Grecian urn. "A boat?" "A yacht, Mom." "It's a yacht," he corrected, a hint of exasperation in his tone. "And listen, this is where you come in. The bank is being a little sticky about the loan. My assets are all tied up in long-term investments. You know how it is. They want another signatory on the note. Someone with stable long-term assets. Someone with, say, a fully owned property." The silence that followed was profound. The only sound was the far-off, rhythmic plinking from the spare room. He couldn't be serious. He had to be joking. My mind struggled to connect the two conversations. A leaky roof he was too cash poor to fix, and a luxury yacht he needed me to finance. The sheer breathtaking audacity of it left me speechless. He heard my silence and barreled on, completely oblivious. "It's just a formality, Mom. You won't have to do anything. Your house is perfect collateral. It's been in the family for ages. Paid off, rock solid. The bank will love it. It's a win-win. I get the yacht, and you help your son build his business. What do you say?" He assumed I had nothing. To him, I was Frances, the retired librarian, a sweet old lady living in a small, slightly shabby house, a woman whose only asset was the very roof she was afraid would collapse on her head. He saw a liability to be managed one week and a resource to be tapped the next. He didn't see a person. He saw a signature. He saw a key. And in that moment, something inside me shifted, a quiet tectonic plate of resentment that had been dormant for decades began to grind. He didn't know about my Uncle Thomas. He didn't know about the portfolio he'd left me. Not a portfolio of stocks and bonds, but of stories, of first editions, a collection of rare books that I had treasured in secret, a legacy of the one family member who had ever truly seen me. Walter just thought they were a bunch of dusty old books in the attic. He had no idea. I found my voice. It was surprisingly steady. "Let me think about it, Walter. I'll have to look at my finances." "What finances?" He laughed. A short, sharp, dismissive bark. "Mom, come on. It's a simple signature. I'll have my assistant send over the papers. We need to move fast on this." "I'll call you back," I said. And I hung up the phone before he could argue. I walked into the spare bedroom and stood over the orange bucket. The water rippled with each new drop. Plink, plink, plink. It wasn't the sound of decay anymore. It was the sound of a clock ticking. It wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about survival. It was about having a roof over my head. But as I stood there, listening to the water hit the plastic, a cold, hard little thought began to form in my mind. Maybe, just maybe, it could be about both. The phone call with Walter left a ringing in my ears that had nothing to do with the receiver. It was the sound of a lifetime of small slights and casual dismissals consolidating into one deafening roar. I sank into the worn floral armchair in my living room. the one Arthur and I had picked out together half a century ago. The springs groaned in sympathy. My hands were trembling, not with age, but with a fury so cold and so deep, it felt like it was freezing my marrow. Cash poor. The words echoed. He was cash poor for a roof, but liquid enough to dream of yachts. He saw my home not as the sanctuary where he took his first steps, where I read him stories and nursed him through fevers, but as collateral, a line on a balance sheet, an asset to be leveraged for his client entertainment. A wave of nausea washed over me. When did my son become a stranger who spoke a different language, a language of transactions and acquisitions? When did his mother become a mere formality? My mind drifted back, sifting through the years, looking for the exact moment the rot had set in. I remembered him as a little boy, no older than 7, with a gap-toothed grin and scraped knees. He'd broken a neighbor's window with a baseball. I'd marched him over there, made him look Mr. Henderson in the eye and apologize, and then he'd spent the entire summer doing chores to pay for the new pane of glass. My Arthur had been so proud. He has to learn responsibility, Francis, Arthur had said, his hand warm on my shoulder. He has to learn that actions have consequences. But somewhere along the line, the lesson had unlearned itself. Arthur passed away too soon, from a heart that had worked too hard for too long. Walter was in college then, already flashing a premature ambition that I mistook for drive. I was grieving, and he was my only link to the future, to the life Arthur and I had planned. And so I began to make exceptions. The time he'd maxed out his first credit card on a ski trip with friends, I'd paid it off, telling myself it was a one-time mistake. The down payment on his first city apartment, the one with rent that made my eyes water, I'd pulled from the savings Arthur and I had earmarked for our own travels. I'd told myself it was an investment in his future. He'd always been good with his words, my Walter. He could spin a narrative of hardship and necessity so compelling that I'd find myself nodding along, writing the check before the story was even finished. It was always for a good reason, to maintain appearances, to network, to get ahead. It was always for the business. And I, a mother who had lost her partner and clung to her son, I wanted to believe him. I had made a promise to Arthur on his deathbed, a quiet whisper in the sterile beeping quiet of the hospital room. I'll look after our boy Arthur, I promise. And I had looked after him. But looking after him had slowly, imperceptibly, morphed into enabling him. My support became his expectation. My sacrifices became his due. The calls stopped being about his life and started being about his needs. He'd call and talk for an hour about a stock that was underperforming, but if I mentioned that the azaleas were in bloom, his attention would drift, the keyboard would start its frantic clicking, and he'd find a reason to end the call. He had no space for the small details of my life. His was too full of big ones. The plink, plink, plink from the other room seemed to mock me. It was a consequence I was living with, the direct result of a problem I had identified and a son who had ignored it. And now he wanted me to underwrite his fantasy. The irony was so bitter it felt like I'd swallowed acid. He was asking me to risk the very thing he refused to protect. I felt a profound sense of loneliness, a hollowness that even the 50 years of memories in this house couldn't fill. I was a ghost in my own life, a service provider whose services were no longer required, except for one last significant transaction. The rain started again that evening, a soft patter at first, then a furious drumming against the windows. The leak picked up its tempo. It was no longer a plink, but a steady drumming trickle, the sound of a problem getting worse. I went into the spare room and saw that the bucket was nearly full. The water stain on the ceiling had darkened, pregnant with moisture, and a new, smaller drip had started a few feet away from the first one. I felt a surge of panic, a primal fear of the roof caving in, of losing everything. I was 72 years old. Where would I go? Walter's sleek city apartment with the perpetually annoyed wife. I could already imagine it. In it, me, a refugee in their minimalist living room, a relic from a life they'd moved beyond. I would be an inconvenience, a piece of old furniture that clashed with the decor. It was in that moment of pure, unadulterated despair that my eyes fell upon the old sea chest in the corner of the room. It had belonged to my Uncle Thomas. It was where I kept the most valuable parts of his collection. Walter had seen it 1,000 times, dismissed it as Mom's old junk. He had no idea what was inside. I knelt, my old knees protesting, and ran my hand over the worn, dark wood. Uncle Thomas was my mother's brother, a bachelor and a scholar who had traveled the world collecting books. He smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather, and he never once spoke down to me, even when I was a little girl. He'd take my questions seriously. When I decided to become a librarian, he was the only one who didn't ask why I wasn't becoming a teacher or a nurse. He'd simply smiled and said, "Of course you are. You're a keeper of stories, Francis. It's in your blood." When he passed, he left his entire collection to me. My parents had been baffled. What's she going to do with all those dusty old things? My father had grumbled. But I knew it was the greatest gift anyone had ever given me. It was a treasure trove of history, of thought, of art. I lifted the heavy lid of the chest. The scent that rose to meet me was my favorite in the world. The rich, complex perfume of aging paper, ink, and leather. It was the scent of permanence, of things that lasted. It was the absolute opposite of Walter's world of flickering numbers on a screen. My fingers traced the spines. The gold leaf now faded, the leather cracked like old skin. A first edition Moby Dick. A signed Virginia Woolf. A slim volume of poetry by a long-forgotten transcendentalist, bound in vellum. These weren't just objects. They were anchors. They were proof of a world that valued substance over flash. My hand stopped on one particular book. It was smaller than the others, bound in a simple dark green cloth. There was no title on the spine. I lifted it out. It was a first edition, first printing of Thoreau's Walden. Uncle Thomas had told me the story. He'd found it in a dusty little shop in Concord, Massachusetts, and paid a pittance for it, because the shopkeeper thought it was a common reprint. Inside the front cover, in my uncle's elegant, spidery script, was a note to Frances, for finding her own pond. I had never understood what he meant. My life had been a service road to other people's destinations, my husband's, my son's. I had never had a pond of my own. I had just been a caretaker of someone else's well. Holding that book, the solid weight of it in my hands, something clicked into place. The despair that had been flooding me began to recede, and in its place, a cold, clear resolve began to form. Uncle Thomas hadn't just left me a collection of books. He had left me a choice. He had left me an escape route. Walter saw my house as my only asset. He was wrong. My greatest asset wasn't the roof and the walls that he was so willing to risk. It was the stories contained within them. Not just the memories, but the actual physical stories sitting in this chest. A plan began to form. Not a grand, complicated scheme, but a simple, direct course of action. I would use the legacy of the man who saw me to solve the problem created by the man who didn't. I would sell a story to save my own. I gently placed Walden back in the chest and closed the lid. The sound was a soft, definitive thud. The decision was made. I walked out of the spare room, leaving the sound of the dripping rain behind me. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't listening to it. I was listening to the quiet, determined beat of my own heart. The apathetic sun, the leaking roof, the condescending offer for a yacht, they weren't the end of my story. They were the inciting incident, and I, Francis, the quiet librarian, was about to start a new chapter. The fallout was over. The resolve had begun. The next morning, the world felt different. The gray light filtering through the kitchen window didn't seem gloomy, it seemed full of potential. The coffee tasted richer. The silence in the house, punctuated only by the drip from the spare room, wasn't a lonely silence anymore. It was the quiet of a library before the doors open, a space humming with stored energy. My anger from the night before had cooled and hardened into something far more useful: purpose. My first task was to turn this abstract notion of value into actual spendable money. I knew the books were precious, but I was a librarian, not a dealer. I had no idea of their market value, not in the cold, hard numbers that paid for roofing contractors. I needed an expert, someone who wouldn't see me as a naive old woman to be fleeced. The thought of walking into a random antique shop filled me with dread. I needed someone trustworthy, someone who understood the soul of a collection, not just its price tag. My mind went back to Uncle Thomas. He had friends, colleagues, a whole world of people who lived and breathed rare books. Most, I assumed, were long gone, just like him, but he used to speak of one man in particular, a young prodigy he'd mentored in Boston, a man named Alistair Abernathy. "The boy has the gift," Francis Thomas would say, tamping his pipe. "He doesn't just see the book, he sees its journey." It was a long shot. This was 30, maybe 40 years ago, but I had a name. I went to my old slow desktop computer, the one Walter was always telling me to replace, and I typed Alistair Abernathy Rare Books into the search bar. The internet, a tool I usually found overwhelming and noisy, delivered a small miracle. There he was, Abernathy and Sons, fine books and manuscripts, not in Boston anymore, but in Philadelphia, just a 2-hour train ride away. The website was elegant and understated, with photographs of leather-bound spines and marbled end papers. It felt right, it felt like Thomas. I spent the next hour composing an email. I wrote and rewrote it, trying to strike the right tone. I didn't want to sound like a desperate woman selling off family heirlooms for roof money. I was the custodian of the Thomas Lowell collection, inquiring about a professional appraisal. I mentioned my uncle's name, hoping it might still carry some weight. I listed a few of the more prominent titles in the collection, including the Walden. I hit send with a trembling finger, my heart thudding against my ribs. What if he didn't remember? What if he wasn't interested? While I waited, I turned my attention to the roof. I would not be a passive victim in this story. I started my research. I looked up the best-rated roofing companies in the county, reading reviews, comparing warranties, and learning the difference between architectural shingles and standing seam metal. I filled a whole notebook with my findings. The process was empowering. With every term I learned, with every company I vetted, I felt a layer of my helplessness sloughing away. I was no longer just Frances, the damsel in distress waiting for her son to rescue her. I was Frances, the project manager. During this time, my phone would buzz with texts from Walter. "Mom, have you thought about the loan? The broker is putting pressure on me." Followed by, "Mom, I'm having my assistant courier the papers to you. Just sign where the tabs are." He didn't call. Calling would require a conversation. Texts were commands, little digital pokes to get me to comply. I ignored them all. My silence, I was discovering, was a powerful tool. It created a vacuum, and his impatient, entitled messages rushed in to fill it, revealing more of his character with every word he typed. He never once asked if I was okay. He never once mentioned the roof. It had been completely erased from his memory, replaced by the gleaming white hull of his 42-foot dream. 2 days later, an email appeared in my inbox. The subject line was simply, "Ray, the Thomas Lowell Collection." My breath caught in my throat. It was from Alistair Abernathy himself. "Dear Mrs. Miller," the email began, the tone formal but warm. "Your email was a wonderful surprise. Thomas Lowell was a giant in his field, and a formative influence on my career. I remember him speaking of his niece, the librarian, with great affection. He would be so pleased to know his collection remains in your care. I would be honored to assist you with an appraisal. The titles you listed are significant, particularly the Thoreau. A first printing in that condition is the stuff of legend. Would you be available for me to come to you? A collection of this importance should not be transported piecemeal. I could be on the train this Friday." Tears welled in my eyes. He remembered Uncle Thomas had been gone for 20 years, but his name still opened doors. His respect for me, a simple librarian, had echoed down through the decades and returned to kindness when I needed it most. It was a confirmation, a sign from the universe that I was on the right path. I booked the appointment immediately, and then I created a new voicemail message on my phone. The old one was my voice, cheerful and accommodating. The new one was brief and robotic. "You have reached the voicemail of 71455500123. Please leave a message." I removed my name. I removed the warmth. I became a number. It was a small act of rebellion, but it felt significant. I was drawing a new boundary, one digital bit at a time. On Friday, a tall, slender man with a shock of white hair and bright, intelligent eyes arrived at my door. He looked to be in his late 60s, and he carried a worn leather satchel. He introduced himself as Alistair Abernathy. His handshake was firm, his smile genuine. "Mrs. Miller, it is an absolute honor," he said, his eyes already scanning the bookshelves in my living room. Thomas was a mentor and a dear friend. He taught me that every book has a story beyond the one printed on its pages. Its provenance, he called it, the life it lived. I felt an immediate kinship with this man. He spoke my language. I led him to the spare room, now tidier, though the bucket remained as a grim centerpiece. He glanced at it and the stained ceiling, his expression one of polite concern, but he didn't comment. He was a man of discretion. I knelt and opened the sea chest. Alistair let out a low whistle. He didn't touch anything at first. He just looked, his head tilted, like a visitor at a museum. "My word, Francis. May I call you Francis?" I nodded. Thomas wasn't exaggerating. "This is magnificent." For the next 3 hours, Alistair Abernathy gave me a master class in my own inheritance. This was the subplot to my life I never knew existed. He'd pick up a book, handle it with the reverence of a surgeon, and tell me its story. He'd point out a binder's mark, a specific flaw in the paper, a type of font that dated it precisely. He knew my uncle's taste, his particular passions. "Ah, the William Blake," he said, holding a slim, unassuming volume. "Thomas chased this for a decade. He finally tracked it down to a little family library in Sussex. The family had no idea what it was. They thought the illustrations were just unsettling drawings. Thomas practically stole it for £50. He chuckled. Its current auction estimate would be around $80,000. I gasped. $80,000. For one book. The number was abstract, unreal. It was more money than I'd ever seen in one place. He went through them one by one, his voice a low, excited murmur. The numbers he quoted were dizzying. "My little house, The one Walter saw as my only asset was in fact a treasure vault. The entire collection, he estimated, was worth, well, he'd need to do a formal, written appraisal, but his off-the-cuff guess was somewhere north of $1 million. Possibly two. I sat on the edge of the bed, my head spinning. A millionaire. I was a millionaire, and I was collecting water in an orange bucket because my son was cash poor. The absurdity, the sheer dramatic irony of it all was so overwhelming that a laugh escaped my lips, a real, genuine laugh. Alistair looked up, a quizzical smile on his face. Good news, I take it. This was my secret leverage. This was the hidden power I never knew I possessed. It was better than a lottery ticket, because I hadn't gotten it by chance. It was a legacy of love and respect from one man, and a tool to fight the lack of respect from another. Alistair, I said, my voice now firm, resolute. I need to sell one, just one, for now. I have a home improvement project that needs funding. He looked at the ceiling again, then back at me, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He was too polite to pry, but he was a man who understood stories, and he could clearly see the outlines of this one. Of course, he said. If you need liquidity quickly, and with minimal fuss, I'd suggest the Thoreau. It's an iconic American classic. There's always a market for it, and it's valuable enough to solve a great many home improvement projects without drawing too much attention to the rest of the collection. He paused. A first printing Walden in this condition. I believe we could expect it to fetch somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000 at auction. $150,000. The number settled in my mind, solid and real. It was more than enough for a new roof. It was enough for new windows, for a new furnace, for a new life. Yes, I said, my voice clear and strong. Let's sell Thoreau. It's time he found a new pond. Alistair handled everything. He arranged for a specialist courier to transport the book to a prestigious auction house in New York. He negotiated the terms. He explained the commission structure and the timeline for payment. He became my ally, my guide into this new world of wealth and independence. He was the voice of reason I didn't know I needed, a kind, knowledgeable man who treated me not as a foolish old woman, but as the worthy custodian of a great treasure. He was, in a way, the executor of my uncle's will, finally helping me understand the true gift Thomas had left me. As Alistair was packing to leave, he turned to me. Francis, he said, his expression serious. Thomas always said that the right book finds you at the right time. It seems Walden has found its moment with you. Use it well. After he left, I stood in the quiet of my home. The plan was no longer a secret, wispy thing. It was a tangible process set in motion. The book was gone, out in the world, on its way to becoming the new roof over my head. Walter's texts continued to arrive, each one more insistent than the last. Mom, this is serious. I could lose the boat. Just sign the papers. I deleted each message without reading it fully. His panic was a distant noise, the buzzing of a fly on the other side of a thick glass window. I was in my own world now, a world of quiet planning and hidden leverage. The takeover had begun, and it was as silent and as powerful as the turning of a page. The 2 weeks I waited for the auction felt like living in a strange, suspended reality. On one hand, my life continued its familiar, quiet rhythm. I did my grocery shopping, tended to my small garden, and worked my way through a stack of mystery novels from the local library. On the other hand, a single, slim book that had rested in a sea chest in my spare room for decades was about to be sold for a sum of money I could barely comprehend. It was a secret I held close, a warm coal glowing in the center of my chest. The dripping in the spare room continued its relentless percussion, but its sound had changed. It was no longer a threat. It was a countdown. Every plink into the orange bucket was a reminder of what I was fighting for. I had already received a quote from the roofing company I'd chosen, Henderson and Sons. Ironically, the son of the man whose window Walter had broken all those years ago. The quote was for $16,250 for a top-of-the-line roof with a 50-year warranty. A 50-year warranty. At my age, that was the very definition of optimism. It was a promise of a future I was securing for myself. Walter's messages had escalated from impatient to frantic. The courier with the loan documents had apparently come and gone, reporting back that no one was home, or at least no one was answering the door. I had, of course, been home, sitting in my floral armchair, sipping tea and reading. The ringing of the doorbell was just another sound I chose to ignore. His texts became a barrage of emotional blackmail and accusations. "Mom, are you getting my messages? What am I supposed to tell the bank? Then is this about the roof money? I told you I was cash poor. This is completely unfair." And my personal favorite, "After everything I do for you." I read that last one and almost laughed. Everything he did for me. What exactly was that? The obligatory distracted phone calls, the Christmas gift certificate to a chain restaurant he sent every year. His doing for me consisted entirely of him existing, of him being my successful son, a fact for which he seemed to believe he deserved continuous reward and zero responsibility. The day of the auction, Alistair called me. "It's today, Francis," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "I'll be monitoring it online. There's no need for you to worry. I'll call you the moment it's over." I thanked him, my throat tight with nerves. That day I couldn't settle. I couldn't read. I paced the small confines of my house, from the living room to the kitchen, my footsteps echoing on the old hardwood floors. I was entrusting my future to a group of strangers in a room in New York, bidding on a story about a man who went to the woods to live deliberately. It felt deeply, profoundly appropriate. At 4:30 in the afternoon, my phone rang. It was Alistair. I snatched it up. "Well?" I breathed. I could hear the smile in his voice. "Well, Francis, it seems two gentlemen were very determined to have their own piece of Walden Pond. The bidding was quite spirited." He paused for dramatic effect. "The final hammer price was $165,000. I sank into a kitchen chair. The phone pressed hard against my ear. $165,000. It wasn't a real number. It was a lottery winning. It was a fantasy. After the auction house premium and my commission, Alistair continued, "The net amount wired to your account will be $138,750. The funds should clear within 3 to 5 business days. Congratulations, Francis. You did it." "No," I said, my voice thick with emotion. We did it, Alistair. Thank you." After I hung up, I just sat there in the quiet of my kitchen for a long time, letting the reality of it wash over me. I was not a poor old woman. I was not dependent. I was a woman of means. The knowledge settled into my bones, straightening my spine. The money arrived 4 days later. I went online to my bank account, a thing I rarely did, and stared at the number on the screen. $138,750. It looked like a typo. I had more money in my checking account than Walter probably thought I had earned in my entire lifetime. My first act was to call Henderson and Sons Roofing. "Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice clear and steady, "this is Francis Miller. I'd like to accept your quote for the new roof. When can you start?" "Mrs. Miller." "That's great news," he said. "We can have a crew out there to drop off the materials on Monday and start the tier off on Tuesday, if that works for you." "That's perfect," I said. And one more thing, I'd like to pay for it in full up front. There was a surprised silence on the other end of the line. Well, ma'am, that's very generous, but it's not necessary. We only require a 50% deposit. I'm aware, I said, but I prefer to settle my accounts. Please email me the invoice, and I'll wire the funds this afternoon. Paying that bill was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. With a few clicks on my computer, I solved my own problem. I didn't need a hero. I didn't need a reluctant cash-poor son to swoop in and save me. I just needed a roof, and I had bought one. The following Tuesday, my quiet little street was filled with the rumble of a large truck and the shouts of men. A crew of 4 roofers began their work. The sound of them tearing off the old rotten shingles was a violent, cathartic noise. It was the sound of the past being ripped away. And then came the sound of the nail guns, a rapid, rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack. It was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. It was the sound of progress, the sound of security, the sound of my silent takeover made manifest. That afternoon, as the roofers were hammering away, my phone rang. It was Walter. I had been ignoring his calls, but this time I decided to answer. I wanted to hear his voice, now that the power dynamic had so irrevocably shifted. Mom, he shouted over the noise of the nail guns. What in the world is that sound? It sounds like a war zone. It's the roofers, dear, I said calmly, taking a sip of my iced tea. I was sitting on my back porch, enjoying the sunshine. There was a stunned silence. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head, the confusion warring with his indignation. Roofers? What roofers? Who's paying for them? I am, Walter, I said simply. You are? With what money? You told me you didn't have any. You expect me to believe you just found $16,000 in your cookie jar. His voice was sharp, accusatory. The idea that I might have resources he didn't know about was to him a form of betrayal. My finances are my own business, Walter, I said. The words felt wonderful in my mouth. I had an asset I chose to liquidate. An asset? What asset? He demanded. You can't just sell the house from under me. The presumption of that statement, that my house was somehow also his, was breathtaking. I haven't sold the house, Walter. I'm repairing it, to make sure it remains a viable asset. I used his own transactional language against him. He was sputtering now, his panic palpable. But the yacht, the loan, the deadline is Thursday. I told you I needed you to co-sign. How could you spend that kind of money right now when I needed it? And there it was, the raw, naked selfishness of his soul, laid bare for me to see. It wasn't about my leaking roof, or my safety. It was about the fact that I had spent his potential loan collateral on myself. My needs had interfered with his wants. I had a critical home repair that couldn't wait. Walter, I said, my voice as cool and calm as the glass of tea in my hand. You told me you were cash poor and couldn't help, so I helped myself. The hammering from the roof was loud and insistent. It was the sound of my independence being nailed into place, one shingle at a time. The silent takeover was no longer silent. It had a soundtrack, and it was glorious. The day Walter showed up was a Wednesday. The roofing was nearly done. The crew was installing the new copper flashing around the chimney, the metal glinting beautifully in the midday sun. I was inside, dusting my living room, when I saw his sleek black car pull up to the curb with a squeal of tires that spoke of impatience and anger. He slammed the car door and strode up my walkway, his face a thundercloud. He didn't bother to knock. He used the key I'd given him years ago, a key I now made a mental note to render useless by changing the locks, and burst into the house. What is going on here, Mother? He demanded. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how I was. His eyes were wild, darting around as if searching for evidence of my betrayal. The rhythmic thwacking of the nail guns on the roof served as a tense backbeat to his entrance. I'm having the roof replaced, Walter, I said, continuing to gently wipe dust from a porcelain figurine. I refused to let his chaotic energy disrupt my peace. I believe I mentioned that to you. You mentioned it, and then you went behind my back and spent a fortune. He seethed. He was pacing now, a caged animal in my small, tidy living room. Where did you get that kind of money? Did you take out a reverse mortgage? Did you sell Dad's old watch? What did you do? The accusation in his voice was thick. He couldn't conceive of me having my own resources, therefore I must have done something foolish or reckless. He wasn't concerned for me. He was concerned that I had somehow devalued his future inheritance. My finances are private, Walter. I said, my voice even. It was a new sentence for me, and it felt powerful. For decades, my finances had been an open book for him to dip into as he pleased. The book was now closed. Private? He scoffed, throwing his hands up in the air. Private? I am your son. We're a family. My financial needs are the family's financial needs. That yacht is an investment in our future. Our future. It was fascinating, the way he used collective pronouns when he wanted something. I seem to recall you being cash poor when the family's need was a roof that didn't leak, Walter. The yacht seems to be a very specific, very personal need. He stopped pacing and stared at me, his mouth agape. It was as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. I was no longer the compliant, accommodating mother he knew. I was someone else, someone who questioned him, who held him accountable. This is unbelievable, he muttered, shaking his head. Just unbelievable. The one time I ask you for something, the one time I really need your help to close a deal that would set me up for life, you decide to go on a spending spree. It was at that moment that my neighbor, Mrs. Gable, chose to make her daily pilgrimage to her mailbox. Eleanor Gable was a woman who had elevated nosiness to an art form, but her heart was generally in the right place. She was also fiercely loyal to me. From my living room window, I saw her pause, her hand on her mailbox, her head tilted like a robin, listening for a worm. The front door was still ajar from Walter's dramatic entrance, and his raised voice was carrying clearly out into the quiet suburban street. A spending spree? I replied, my voice rising just enough to make sure Eleanor got the full picture. You call keeping my home from rotting a spending spree? I lived with a bucket in my spare bedroom for months, Walter. While you were whining and dining clients, I asked you for help. Your exact words were, I'm cash poor. Is your memory that selective? Walter's face flushed a deep mottled red. He was a man who lived and died by appearances, and he was being challenged, loudly, in a way that might be overheard. He strode to the door and pulled it shut with a sharp tug. Keep your voice down, he hissed. You're making a scene. No, Walter, I said, finally putting down my dustcloth and giving him my full attention. You made a scene when you came in here. I am simply responding to it. This was the power shift, happening right here in my living room. For years, he had held all the power of his success, the power of my maternal love and guilt, the power of my financial dependence. But that was all gone. The foundation of our relationship had been a series of assumptions, and all of them were false. He assumed I was poor. He assumed I was weak. He assumed I needed him more than he needed me. He had assumed wrong. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and his face grew even tighter. It's the broker, he said, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. The deadline for the financing is tomorrow at noon. Mom, please, just sign the papers. Whatever you spent on the roof, we can figure it out later. I'll pay you back. I promise. The promise was hollow, and we both knew it. It was the desperate gambit of a man who was out of moves. He was trying to revert to the old dynamic, the one where his promises were enough to get him what he wanted. But I wasn't playing that game anymore. No, Walter, I said. The word was simple, but it was a wall. No, he looked stunned, as if the word itself was a physical blow. What do you mean? No, I mean I will not be co-signing your loan for a yacht, I stated clearly. My financial situation has changed. I am no longer in a position to take on that kind of risk. He stared at me, his mind racing, trying to process this new reality. The sounds from the roof had stopped. The crew was likely on their lunch break. The silence in the house was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Time was running out for him. You've changed, Mom, he finally said, his voice a mixture of confusion and resentment. Yes, Walter, I replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. I suppose I have, or perhaps I'm just finally becoming the person I was supposed to be all along. He left without another word. He didn't slam the door this time. He closed it softly, a gesture of defeat. I watched from the window as he got back into his car and sat there for a long moment, his head in his hands, before driving away. Later that afternoon, Eleanor Gable appeared at my door with a plate of lemon bars. I brought you a little something, she said, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. It sounded like you were having a rather spirited discussion earlier. Walter was just expressing some concerns about my recent home improvement project, I said, a small smile playing on my lips. Well, she said, stepping inside and handing me the plate. I must say that new roof looks marvelous. A good, solid roof. It's the most important thing, isn't it? A foundation you can count on. I looked at her, and we shared a moment of perfect, unspoken understanding. The power had not just shifted between me and my son, it had shifted within me. I was no longer a damsel in distress. I was the queen in her newly fortified castle. The family exodus wasn't about relatives leaving. It was about the unhealthy, one-sided dynamic itself being evicted from my life. And I had never felt more at home. The new roof was finished on Thursday morning. The crew packed up their tools, cleaned every last nail and scrap of shingle from my lawn, and left my little house looking proud and renewed. The dark gray shingles were crisp and clean. The copper flashing around the chimney gleamed like a piece of jewelry, and inside, the ugly water stain on the spare room ceiling was just a bad memory waiting to be plastered and painted over. For the first time in almost a year, my home felt truly and completely secure. It was quiet. The dripping had stopped. I spent the morning in a state of peaceful bliss. I made myself a pot of good tea, put on a record of Chopin nocturnes, and sat in my floral armchair, simply enjoying the silence. It was a profound and deeply satisfying quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a storm. At 11:30, just as I knew he would, Walter called. His name flashed on the caller ID, and I let it ring 3 times before I answered, just to savor the moment. Hello, Walter, I said, my voice calm and pleasant. Mom, his voice was thin, stretched, and frayed at the edges. All the bluster and anger from the day before was gone, replaced by a raw, naked desperation. Mom, I'm at the bank. The broker is here. We have 30 minutes. Please, I'm begging you. Just tell me you'll sign. You can do it electronically. My assistant can walk you through it, please. He was pleading. My son, the master of the universe, the stockbroker who hobnobbed with important men on golf courses and in boardrooms, was begging his retired librarian mother to save him. It wasn't a moment of triumph for me, not in the way you might think. It was just sad. It was pathetic. He had built his entire world on a foundation of shifting sand, of leverage and appearances, and now the tide was coming in. Walter, I said, and I kept my voice even and gentle, the way a doctor might deliver a difficult diagnosis. I told you yesterday. My answer is no. But why? He wailed, his voice cracking. I don't understand. You have money now. You bought a roof. You can afford to do this. It won't cost you a thing, unless I default. And I'm not going to default. This yacht will pay for itself in 6 months. And there it was again. The complete and utter disconnect. He still didn't get it. He thought my refusal was about money, about risk, about the numbers on a page. He couldn't grasp that it was about something else entirely. It was about respect. It was about dignity. It was about the gaping chasm between a mother's need for a safe home and a son's desire for a floating toy. The most damning part, the detail that truly sealed his fate in my heart, was that in all his ranting and pleading, in all his demands and accusations since he'd found out about the roof, he had never once asked the most basic, most logical question. Mom, how did you get the money? He didn't care. The source of my sudden solvency was irrelevant to him. He didn't wonder if I'd won the lottery, or if Arthur had left a secret insurance policy, or if I'd sold something. He wasn't curious about my life, or my good fortune. He only saw that a resource he had mentally earmarked for himself had been used for another purpose. His lack of curiosity was the most profound insult of all. It proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he did not see me. He saw an ATM that had inexplicably begun dispensing cash for its own needs. I took a deep breath. It was time to deliver the final line of our long dysfunctional play. It was the line I had been rehearsing in my head for days. I almost felt sorry for him, but the memory of the dripping bucket, of my fear and his dismissal, hardened my resolve. I'm sorry, Walter, I said. And the apology was for the dream of a son I once had, not for the man on the other end of the line. I can't possibly co-sign the loan. All of my funds are tied up. I paused, letting the silence hang in the air before delivering the killing blow, a phrase crafted from his own casual cruelty. You see, I said, my voice as quiet and final as a closing door, they're all tied up in home maintenance. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear nothing. Not a breath, not a keystroke, not the frantic energy of a bank office. It was the sound of a mind processing a reality it was not equipped to handle. It was the sound of checkmate. And then I heard a small, sharp click. He had hung up. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear and placed it back in its cradle. It was over. The confrontation I had both dreaded and craved hadn't been a shouting match or a dramatic showdown. It had been a quiet, simple refusal, a single word, no, backed by the conviction of a woman who had finally learned her own worth. I stood up and walked into the spare room. The orange bucket was gone. I had taken it out to the garage that morning. The ceiling was a smooth, unblemished expanse of old plaster, waiting for a fresh coat of paint. The room was just a room again, full of possibility. I stood at the window and looked out at my little garden. The sun was shining, my roof was new, and my house was quiet. A deep, profound peace settled over me. This was my new reality. A life where I was the sole signatory. A life where my assets, both financial and emotional, were mine and mine alone to manage. It wasn't vindication in the fiery, vengeful sense. It was a quiet, solid, and deeply satisfying reclamation. The months that followed were some of the most peaceful of my life. The silence in my house was no longer a symbol of loneliness, but of serenity. I had the spare room plastered and painted a lovely, soft shade of buttercup yellow. It became my reading room, a bright, cheerful space where I surrounded myself with the books I loved, the ones I hadn't sold. I spent a little more of Uncle Thomas's legacy, not on anything grand, but on small comforts. I replaced the drafty old windows, installed a walk-in shower to make things easier on my knees, and bought myself a ridiculously comfortable new armchair. Each improvement was a quiet declaration of independence. I didn't hear from Walter. Not a call, not a text, not even an angry scrawled note. The silence from his end was telling. He wasn't silent because he was reflecting or feeling remorse. He was silent because I was of no use to him anymore. I had failed to perform my function, and in his transactional world, that meant I ceased to exist. It hurt, but it was a clean surgical pain, not the dull, chronic ache of being constantly taken for granted. News of his life came to me in snippets, through the neighborhood grapevine, usually delivered by Eleanor Gable, over a cup of tea. She had a cousin whose daughter worked at the bank Walter used. The story, as she pieced it together, was that the yacht deal had collapsed in a rather spectacular fashion. Losing the financing at the last second had apparently spooked the investors he was trying to woo. It made him look unstable, unreliable. In the world of high finance, perception is everything, and the perception of Walter was suddenly that of a man who couldn't manage his own affairs. There were whispers of him losing a major client, of his bonus being significantly smaller that year. He didn't lose his job, but a certain shine had definitely come off his brilliant career. He got what he deserved, not because I wished him ill, but because his own arrogance and short-sightedness had finally caught up with him. Actions, as my dear Arthur always said, have consequences. One afternoon, Alistair Abernathy called me. "Frances," he said warmly, "I have a proposition for you. A museum in Boston is putting together an exhibition on New England transcendentalist writers. They are desperately searching for a first edition Walden to be the centerpiece. They don't have the budget to purchase one, but they would be honored to display yours, with full credit to the Thomas Lowell collection, of course." I smiled. The idea of Thoreau's book, the very instrument of my liberation, being admired by thousands, was a beautiful, poetic ending to its journey with me. But I had a better idea. "Alistair," I said, "what if we sold them another book, something less iconic, but still valuable, and used the funds to endow a small program at my local library?" The idea had been forming in my mind for weeks. A program for children, to teach them the joy of stories. And so we did. We sold a lovely but not irreplaceable Hawthorne First Edition. The $138,000 in my bank account was more than enough for me, a woman of simple needs. The proceeds from the Hawthorne established the Arthur and Frances Miller Reading Hour at the public library, where I had worked for 40 years. My new life wasn't just about security. It was about creating a legacy of my own, one that had nothing to do with my son's ambition. So now, here I am. I'm sitting in my new, ridiculously comfortable armchair in my warm, dry, and peaceful house. The sun is setting, and the light is turning the leaves in my garden to gold. My life is small, but it is entirely my own. I know some of you watching might think I was harsh. Some might say, "But he's your son." And you're right, he is my son, and I will always love the little boy with the scraped knees that I raised in this house. But you are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep others warm, especially when they are the ones who stole the firewood. It wasn't about revenge, until it was. But it wasn't revenge against my son. It was revenge against the person I had allowed myself to become, a silent, accommodating doormat. The final stand I took was for myself. My story, I hope, is a reminder that it is never, ever too late to find your own voice. It's never too late to read the fine print of your own life and decide you want to renegotiate the terms. Your value isn't determined by the people who overlook you. It's something you decide for yourself. Sometimes, the most valuable assets we have are the ones that other people have dismissed as old, dusty, and worthless. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it brought you a little bit of satisfaction and maybe a little bit of strength. If you have a similar story, I'd love to read about it in the comments below. It helps to know we're not alone. And please, if you enjoyed this, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories like mine. It helps more than you know. Take care of yourselves, and don't be afraid to buy your own roof.